Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. Thank you for the great work that you're doing and sort of, driving these conversations around the world about the future of education and so forth. So again, my name is Gerald Hodges, and I serve as Impact Officer at Hilltop Schools. So basically, Hilltop Schools is a library and NGO with a mission to ensure children's rights to education, safety, and health. And we serve over 3,300 students across 19 schools in urban slum and rural farming and mining communities in Liberia, West Africa. And so when the first case of COVID-19 was reported in Liberia, the government instituted a lockdown. So that also affected the schools that we operate in, all schools in Liberia. And as an educational organization, we wanted to ensure that our students are still learning while at home and that they're healthy and safe during this time as well. So specifically in terms of, ensuring that they're safe and that their rights are not being, abused, one of the things that we've been doing is our social workers have been doing weekly check-ins on the families to ensure that the students are being well treated at home and that they're safe. But prior to that happening, what we did was we had our distribution of food and wash supplies, essentially water, hygiene, and sanitation supplies. That was somewhere in March, let's say April. And so essentially we invited parents, ensuring that obviously we practice social distancing on our campus in Monrovia, at our All Girls Academy in Monrovia. So we invited parents over. We talked to them about COVID-19, basically educated them about what the virus was all about and how they can ensure that they're safe and healthy during this time. And so during that process, we also provided weekly lesson packets, bi-monthly lessons packets to ensure that students were learning while at home. In addition to that, we also distributed food to the parents to ensure that the students were having at least 3 meals per day. But critically, to the point specific of ensuring that their rights weren't being abused at home, what we did was to remind parents that, they have to ensure that they're protecting the children, they're not abusing them. They had to ensure that they're helping the students with their distance learning exercises while at home. We also reminded them that we'll be checking on them weekly. So that brings to the point, my next point regarding what we've been doing over the last couple of months. So as you may be aware, one of the major challenge or let's say global challenge around the world since COVID-19 has been gender and sexual based violence has increased in homes, domestic violence especially. So in addition to just reminding our parents what we do on a weekly basis, our social workers call in to check up on the students. So they do weekly check-ins to ensure that the students are actually safe, and they basically report on their health status as well as their safety status on a weekly basis to our social workers. So should in case there is any problem, our social workers go further to do home visits just to ensure that the students are safe while they're staying home. In Liberia specifically, obviously there's been interruption of learning and assessment, given that the country was on a lockdown and schools were closed. As a matter of fact, we just officially reopened. Our lockdown ended yesterday. So schools have been closed, and so that has interrupted learning. The government specifically has piloted what they're calling the learning by radio program. Basically, they've been working with different partners in disseminating educational lessons through the radio. But then one major challenge with that is access to radio. For majority of the students, especially those living in rural communities, as far as radio coverages has been an issue, beyond just radio coverages reaching to them, one other challenge has been um, the fact that many families don't actually own a radio. So how do you run such a program on radio? You realize that there's still a huge inequality between those, especially in rural communities, versus those students in urban communities because of lack of access to radio. There's also been loss of income for teachers, so you realize that teachers are not in school, so their livelihood has equally been impacted by this situation. On top of that, there's been high economic and social burden on parents, who many of the parents, especially for the parents we serve in our schools, like I mentioned, we run about 19 schools, and students from our schools are really from poor and vulnerable uh, communities and homes. And so there's been high economic and social burden on these parents to actually feed their kids. And that's the reason why one of the things that we've done as an organization is to do monthly distribution of food supply, just to be able to support these families to support these families during this time. I also did mention the probability of increased, gender and sexual based violence, um, teenage pregnancy as well. So one of the things that for us in particular at Hilltop School we've been doing on top of just the safety, we've also been doing health monitoring as well. So whenever our social workers and our health team checks in on students, they do ask them questions regarding their health status to ensure that they're healthy and safe during this time. So those are some of the challenges as far as the context of Liberia and the work that Hilltop School does that we've seen. When it comes to the issue of distance learning as compared to more advanced country, you realize that in Liberia, internet penetration is really low. The last time I checked, it was at 12%. And just beyond the fact that we have low internet penetration, we also have like I mentioned, access to radio to broadcast in remote villages. Even if you had cell phones, also you don't have access to network to be able to follow through these distance learning program. And as compared to other developed countries where most learning has migrated to online, not many people in Liberia do have access to the resources to be able to follow through distance learning online. Beyond that, also the cost of internet is one of the highest in Liberia. So essentially, $2 gets you on the network that I use. $2 US dollars would get you 1.2 gigabytes. So and that's pretty much if you're taking a course online. You most likely will be only able to do about an hour to 2 hours of being present on the internet. So those are some of the challenges as far as the context of Liberia when it comes to just learning and the inequalities across the country. So a big part of the conversation I've had with my colleagues at work has been how beyond COVID-19, how can we look at modeling our education in a way that triggers self-learning in our students. So essentially, our model of education has been based on rote learning and traditional learning methods, going to classroom and receiving knowledge, and that's the only way. But how do you sort of trigger children's curiosity and train them to become independent learners? Because with the evolution of technology and a lot of revolution that's happening right now when it comes as far as education and distance learning, you realize for people or for students to be able to you know readjust their lifestyle to sitting down behind a device, be it the television, the radio, or a computer, or their mobile phones to actually learn. they have to develop that, discipline, that attitude towards learning by themselves. So we have to figure out within our education system moving forward, how do we change our way of teaching to sort of facilitating students' thirst for, or to sort of triggering students' thirst for learning. Now, that's one aspect. So that could mean adapting a blended learning approach or project-based learning approach, and there are many other models out there. Um, Another thing I would say is policy-wise in Liberia, in Liberia's context, over the last year or so, there's been increase in the cost of access to internet. So like I mentioned, it costs about $2 to purchase 1.2 gigabyte of data. And so when you find that happening, and that has been triggered mainly by the taxes that the government has imposed on the GSM companies, because the government has imposed new taxes on the GSM companies. The GSM companies have increased their prices, obviously. And quite recently, there's been recent debate again. The government apparently has been trying to increase the taxes. And if the government keeps on increasing the taxes on GSM companies, the cost of access to internet is going to obviously be on, the burden is going to be on the citizen to actually consume data. And so for learning purposes, as far as transitioning from, traditional methods of learning towards adapting technology, it's going to be really difficult for a country as ours. So one policy advice obviously will be for government to actually work with GSM companies to reduce these tariffs, or potentially make online learning platforms actually free, and for it to become more accessible for people who cannot afford the means to actually learn online. So I would say those are those are two key things that moving forward we have to look at. Another thing is we also have to figure out a way that we can integrate, parents into the children's learning process. I think for our education system right now, parents are not much involved in the learning of their kids, so COVID has come to shift that, because many parents have had to sort of serve as teachers at home. And so for Liberia's context, you realize that we have a high illiteracy rate in Liberia, and so there has to be an equal investment in integrating or sort of including parents in the learning of their kids. So yeah, those are, I would say, based on our context, are three areas that we potentially will have to look at moving forward. One, how do we sort of uh, model our education system to trigger self-learning in students? That's one. Secondly, how do we, if we're transitioning to technology-based, platforms and adapting to those changes that are happening across the world, how do we make it more cost effective for students to actually tap onto those opportunities to learn online? And third, how do we sort of um, support parents in the process of serving as teachers as well?